Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Dear Lord, we thank you that we can be in a place to study your scriptures. May we learn from the examples and learn what not to do in other examples and grow all the more closer to you. Amen.
Amen.
So last week we did not finish chapter 24 with Rebecca and Isaac. So I want to finish that part. I think we didn't even start it because we were kind of getting near the end of our time. So I want to move through that story. And what we said last week is we are finishing that Abraham cycle. And then we're starting a new cycle that a lot of commentators will call the Jacob cycle or the Jacob story. The Jacob story is more popular just for consistency. I think in the slides I put Jacob cycle. I think I put Jacob cycle. So I might switch between calling it the Jacob story or the Jacob cycle, but that's this new kind of section that we're going to be starting. Before we begin and look at it, any questions or parts that stood out for you from what we read, either in chapter 24 or parts of the others?
Yeah, I noticed that we hear a repeat of what Abraham did.
Yes.
He does the same thing. He calls his wife his sister and the Pharaoh and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I guess that's part of chiasm or whatever.
It's a chiasm, and actually we have a slide on, we're going to look at some different repeated motifs. Well, somewhere. There's a lot of themes that are going to get repeated, and we talked about that way in the beginning when we started chapter 12. In Hebrew, you don't underline or bold, and there's not a table of contents to kind of draw attention. So if you really want to get something to stick, especially when you're coming from an oral tradition, you just tell the same story lots of times. And then it will start to stick in your mind. And so a lot of these themes are going to get repeated. And if you remember that chiasm we had for Abraham, there was the sister fib part 1, the sister fib part 2.
Yeah.
One of our outlines here is the sister fib part 3. And if we have a part 4, I'm just going to be sad because they're not learning their lesson. You don't lie and call your wife your sister, or at least not tell the full truth. Any other parts that stood out? Yeah.
Okay, so Isaac is supposed to be the favored son.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But he had the fewest descendants.
Yeah. So this is one of the themes that we're going to see. And
He had the fewest what? I'm sorry.
Descendants.
yeah. And Abraham also. So the whole stories that we've begun, we've talked about this zooming in, and there's been this moment where the wife, like the faithful wife through whom the covenant marriage will come through, is barren. That theme is going to keep being repeated, and we're gonna see it the next generation. It's going to start over with Joseph. If you remember Jacob, who's then called Israel, he's going to have a favored wife, Rachel. And she can't have kids, so he has 3 other wives. And finally, Joseph and Benjamin are born. This is another one of those themes that's going to get repeated. It's hard to have a son, and the younger son becomes the one who kind of lifts up. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Well, yeah, I'm excited. You guys you're catching up all the themes we're going to talk about. So, any other parts that stood out?
Gosh, after 4 months, we're starting to get some of this.
Well, when it's repeated so much, it feels like you're getting hit over the head with it. The Brotherhood has a Bible study that they go one chapter at a time. And they went through Genesis and kept going. And Janie's shaking her head because I guess you heard some of it from Alan. Mm-hmm. And I can only imagine only going through one chapter at a time through this. It would make it feel real slow.
Alexander, just one other question. Over here.
Oh, okay.
One of the descendants is Sheba. Would that be like the Queen of Sheba?
I don't think so in this
These
instance.
These are all males, are they? These are all males?
Unless it is otherwise noted. So like on that left side, there's a girl that's married to Esau. So she is said, like, there's a daughter there. Okay. Usually the ones that get listed are the men, unless there's some kind of marriage connection. Susan's like, what? All right, let's look at this. So this was a question we had last week, so I just wanted to look back at it And we have 2 new people that are watching online that are going to start watching this week. So if they're watching this will have it as well. So this is a simplified version of this chart of when the different parts of the Bible were written. But I thought it would just be helpful to look at it one more time. So if you're this little corner up here, this is the Torah, those first 5 books of the Bible. We call those the words or the law. Sometimes we call them the Pentateuch. But it's kind of the heart of the Torah. And that's made up of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In Genesis and Exodus, there are 2 main sources that make it up. It's the priestly and the non-priestly. And so that is when we have our color coding, green is non-priestly and blue is priestly. And that is kind of the main thing. When you're looking at it, just remember, when you're reading blue, this one's priestly. It's newer, so it was written later. And then you have the non-priestly. And the non-priestly sources were made up from all these different oral traditions, and there's a lot of layers that you can get into it. It's not that important. But what we've been talking about is there's 2 kind of origin stories that make it up. One of those is centered around Abraham. One of those is centered around Moses. And that's the Yahwist or the Elohist source. Hello.
Sorry, Alexander. We just
Where'd you get that one?
food delivery.
Oh, that's exciting.
Food delivery.
We're just doing a recap. These are some jokes that Donna brought in that are funny. So that is the non-priestly source. It's not that important, but there is differences. They use different languages for describing things. They talk about God in different ways. There's a different kind of focal point. Most of what we have read so far has been the Yahwist source. And that's the source that kind of centers around Abraham. When you see bold green, that's the Elohist source. And that is where Exodus is made up a lot of the Elohist source. And that's the one that centers around Moses. And that is from the northern kingdom of Israel. There's differences, but it's not that important. Some people really like to focus on it. Last week, we finished the Abraham cycle. And so we've usually said this section continues the Abraham cycle. Last week we said we're going to conclude the Abraham cycle. And we looked at a couple of different parts. We saw Isaac was born last week, and Ishmael gets kicked out. But he wasn't kicked out in a shameful way. He still goes out with a blessing. There was that promise he's going to be a great nation as well. And this is all of the Ishmael sons on the back of the handout. So these are these 12 princes that are, story has it that he is the father of Arabia and Northern Africa. And so you can see those people here. And then we saw the sister fib part 2, where Abraham is with Abimelech. And then we saw that uncomfortable story where Isaac is going to be sacrificed. And we talked about that last time. I don't want to go back into that. And then Sarah dies. And if you remember, we had some pictures of you can see today. You can go to her tomb, probably not her tomb. But there's a place that is this holy grave site that the patriarchs are at, along with Sarah. And we talked about how that section was this insert. Like the language there is very, very different. And it's very legalistic. And it's kind of like setting out a contract. Because if your ancestors are in a land, then you have rights to that land. And so this section was very clear when Abraham buys this grave site that Sarah goes to. He paid the king's ransom for it. He didn't buy it at market price. It was really expensive. And Sarah goes there. And that gives them rights to the land. Which if you're going to come conquer a land, it's nice for it to belong to you. And then we didn't get to Isaac and Rebekah. So Isaac is born, and if you remember Abraham and Sarah, Abraham is kind of on his deathbed, and he looks at his household servant Eliezer, and he's like, I don't want him to be married to a Canaanite. Go back to my land and go and find him a wife. And they do that ritual. We talked about the holding under the thigh. And John, you shared, I think your story from, I don't remember what part of Africa it was.
Southern part.
The southern part of Africa. Could you share that story, a brief version of it?
When young men and women reach the age of 14, they are abducted at night by the elders of the tribe, and the boys go up with the older men into the mountains, and the women go up with the older ladies, and they learn about their tribe, and they learn about their customs. They learn songs. The boys learn how to fight. The women learn about childbirth and all that. And during the ceremony, all the boys are circumcised. It's called circumcision school, and all the women have sticks poked up them. So when they come back down, they are considered adults. It's a very specific time, and the whole village says, "Okay, we recognize you as an adult."
I guess we talked about that with the birth of Isaac and circumcision. There are different cultural phenomena that people have that sound outrageous to us. This under the thigh one and circumcision rituals, they sound weird and crazy, but this is a normal thing. And this going under the thigh part, you're very close to someone's genitals when you reach up their robes, and it was about it was a serious promise when someone was to do that. So that is why that going under the thigh part. But it means a promise, and it means a serious promise. And so the servant goes out into this land to find a wife. And if you remember, he gets to the well, and he and his camel are really thirsty. And this one woman, she's beautiful and young and kind and generous, and she gets them water and keeps watering them. And it's a very long chapter that is bragging on how beautiful and how good and righteous Rebecca is. And I think I had said this last week, but it's almost like this chapter is describing Rebecca as one who walks with God. And we kind of looked at how Isaac and Rebecca are this special couple. So it doesn't say this about the other patriarchs, but it says that Isaac loved Rebecca. And so they're kind of like the couple you want to be. We're going to find out the next chapter that maybe by the time you get old, you're not as well favored as you used to be in your youth. But Rebecca ends up agreeing to marry Isaac, and they are kind of seen as the favorite couple. The other part that has to do with that is they are the monogamous couple. And we've talked about that before, is when one way of telling stories and teaching you what's right and what's wrong is to teach by example. And so every instance that someone has more than one wife, it never really works out well. It always causes problems. Apparently, even if you have more than one kid, it's still going to cause problems, as we're going to see in chapter 25. But it's still teaching you. And so if you're kind of looking as an example to be as a couple, be like Isaac and Rebecca. I had on here, let's read chapter 60 to the end. Would anyone want to read that little section right there?
Chapter what now?
This is chapter 24, verse 60, until the end. This is the blessing on Rebecca. It's kind of like it sounds like Mary's blessing in Luke. All right.
May you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes. Then Rebekah and her maids rose up, mounted the camels, and followed the men. And the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Now Isaac came from their whatever, and was settled in the Negev. Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field, and looked up, and he saw camels coming. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel, and said to the servant, "Who is the man over there walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death.
So endearing. It's so cute. So she is now lifted up as this matriarch. And if you'll notice this part where it starts off, she goes off with someone she doesn't really know with these promises of great things, and she's blessed in this way. It almost reminds you of Abraham. When God comes to Abraham and a God that he doesn't know, and it gives him all these blessings if he goes off to a different land. So here we're seeing Rebecca's faith. She really is kind of lifted as one you should be like. They are lifted up as like the ideal kind of couple. They're who you should be. Before we move on from them, any comments or thoughts about meeting Rebecca? Do you want to be like Rebecca?
Well, women still had to be veiled back then.
Yes, and that was a way of protecting the beauty only for the husband to have. So that is still a practice that is done in the Middle East.
Right, but the men didn't have to be veiled to protect their handsomeness. Just the women had to be
Yeah.
veiled.
You better not cut your hair either.
Reminds me of Mary. That's our glowing.
It does. This kind of part about, this has to do with her having lots of kids and being really wealthy. But it makes me think in a lot of ways of that blessing of Mary that's in chapter Luke, in the Gospel of Luke. Any other things stand out here? I think this is it's a sweet little story. A sweet little story about her. There is some weird font that is this bold with the green highlight. This is yet another little source that popped up last week, and I just want to say it again. So the Yahwist, which is the J, and the Elohist, which is the E, was this oral. They were both oral traditions. And those two oral things then get compiled by a redactor, but it's not the kind of final editor. It's someone who compiled those oral traditions, the non-priestly sources. That is there. You don't have to pay attention to it. If it's green, it means it's non-priestly. If it's blue, it means priestly. I just wanted to put it in because it's there. So let's get to chapter 25. Oh, before we did, I just wanted to finish our chiasm for Abraham. So if you remember, we started with that genealogy, and here we saw this other genealogy back in chapter 22, and those are kind of the bookends, somewhat of Abraham's story. And there was this test of faith that Abraham has, and we see that other test of faith with Isaac that we saw last week. And then there's the sister fibs, part 1 and part 2. We're going to see part 3 today, and those are kind of the bookend. He saves Lot. Remember that middle of the Abraham story. There's those two covenant stories, one where they cut the animals in half, the other where they cut the foreskin. And in the middle of that is this promise with Hagar and Ishmael, and we see this very generous and merciful God who sees and hears and cares. And that's kind of the middle of this story of Abraham. God is making a covenant with Abraham to bless the whole world. And you see a little bit of that blessing there with Hagar and Ishmael. This isn't a blessing to make Abraham and his people great. It's a blessing through Abraham to everyone else. That's Abraham's story. And we're going to see that story continued with his family. And that's going to mean that we're going to come kind of into a new section. So we've talked about these 10 told-offs, those generations. We've been in the generation of Terah. And now we're going to kind of move in chapter 25. We're going to look a little bit at Ishmael's, and then we're going to come to Isaac, and then we're going to come to Esau eventually. So we're right here now. And we just call this the Jacob story. That covers all of these. So we spent a long time on Abraham. Now we're going to spend a pretty long time on Jacob and Jacob's sons. But this is kind of, this whole section we call the Jacob story, or the Jacob cycle. There we go. And this is the chiasm that's in the Jacob cycle. Does anyone have the New Oxford Annotated Bible? No, wow. Almost every brother on Tuesday morning uses that. Okay, well, if you do, this might look familiar. This is the notes. They call it the Jacob story. I'm calling it the Jacob cycle. But they have about the same chiasm. But I made a different one that has kind of a new point in the middle. They end theirs just with Jacob being multiplied, both in his flocks and with his wives. But so this starts, and this is one of those themes we're going to see, struggle and childbirth. And so it begins, the Jacob story begins when he's born, and there's struggle and childbirth. And so we see it with Rebekah. in our timeline, Isaac is 40 when he marries Rebekah. They're not born until he's 60 years old. So it's been 20 years waiting to have kids. So you can kind of sympathize with these women whose kind of whole job is to have kids, waiting for decades. And it's almost like a test of their faith. And so finally, and it's a troublesome pregnancy, and Jacob and Esau are born. But it starts with struggles in childbirth. That is going to be mirrored to Rachel, who is going to be Israel or Jacob's favorite wife, who is going to eventually have Joseph and Benjamin, and they're struggling in childbirth there. We're going to see that Jacob is going to end up becoming afraid of Esau, and he flees. Later, there's going to be this reconciliation with Esau, but there's still this fear there. He's going to arrive in a land, he's going to leave the land. But there's this fun part, and I can't wait until we get to this, where Jacob works for his father-in-law in Lebanon. Does anyone remember this? And there's all these things with the sheep and the goats, and Jacob's kind of conniving, so he makes a deal that he can have all of the speckled goats. And so he takes all of the speckled males and all of the speckled females, and he divides them and mixes them with all of the purebred ones with no speckles. And he ends up like stealing all of his sheep. And so he's a conniving person, but what he's going to go along the way is he is blessed in that he multiplies. God multiplies Jacob and his family. He's going to multiply his kids. Again, if you look at that chart, this guy was pretty prolific. He did not struggle like his fathers did. He has lots of kids. That's where we kind of get those 12 tribes of Israel from. But there's this focal point in Jacob's story with the birth of Joseph, which is probably a story that you know very well. And that's going to kind of be the focal point. And the reason for this is we're seeing the covenants continue. The middle of Abraham's story was the renewing of the covenant and what that covenant looks like when it's played out. Now we're going to see how that covenant begins to take shape with the family it's going to carry through. So when you come through the Jacob story, just remember we're leading up to Joseph, who's going to be the favorite of the sons. And once again, it's a younger son that's being raised up. That's the same chiasm. Okay, so this is an overview of what we're going to look at today. So we are going to begin the Jacob cycle or the Jacob story. We looked already at Genesis 24 with Isaac and Rebekah. And then we're going to come to chapter 25. And I just put hello, Keturah, and goodbye, Abe. I would have said Abraham, but it didn't fit. And then we're going to see another genealogy yet again. These are really just one section. It's kind of the concluding remarks about Abraham's life and his descendants. And then we're going to meet Esau and Jacob. And we're going to spend some time with Esau and Jacob this week. Chapter 26, it's the Sister Fib part 3. Can't wait till we get there. It might sound familiar. Hopefully y'all can tell me the story at this point. And then we're going to get to chapter 27. And this is that, I don't know if it would say controversial. I'm trying not to say weird or whatever it is that I always say, or strange. Where Isaac steals the blessing from Esau. And we'll talk about that when we get there, but it's going to result that Jacob flees. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So there are some themes you're going to see repeated in the story of Jacob that we've already read so far. There's more covenants. There's more blessings. There's all these lying about your sister. There's barren wives. There's the younger son who comes up. There's renaming and kind of becoming a new person. And all of these they're going to keep being repeated. And again, like we said at the beginning, that's a way of storytelling. And so it's repeating it to kind of put it in your face and in your mind. But I think, to me, the biggest points that we're going to see is this idea of the younger son becoming the one who is blessed and takes the covenant. It kind of flips the cultural expectation upside down. You would think it would be the older son. That's who normally would take the inheritance. Oftentimes, the way inheritance would work is that if you had 3 sons, there would be 4 portions of an inheritance. 2 of them would go to the oldest son, and then everyone else gets 1 share of the inheritance. what happens in these stories is that the younger son gets all of the inheritance, all of the blessing. And that means that he receives the whole household, so all of the money, all of their resources, all of the servants, everything. But what we're going to find is also these prophetic blessings, and we'll get to those when we get to that part about Isaac. And many of these motifs, they're going to keep being repeated. And when you see naming things happen, always pay attention to the names. We've talked before how names are serving like titles here. Think of them less as personal names, more like a title describing a person or who they are or what kind of role they're playing in the story. Now let's move into chapter 25. Hello, Keturah, and goodbye, Abe. So this is this genealogy that's here. I don't want to spend too much time looking at it. There is some important parts. So Ishmael has like there's these 12 princes that get named. So this is showing us this is the last time Ishmael really gets mentioned. And remember that promise that God made Ishmael and Hagar that Ishmael would be great? Yeah, look, it's fulfilled right here. He has all these sons. It's kind of finishing up his story. And this insert in chapter 25 is thought to be a quite later kind of added on part.
You have no daughters?
We get one daughter named. Could have had more. The only reason that this daughter is named is because she marries Esau. So he could have had more. We don't know. Wasn't important enough to write down, I guess. So, and we've talked about this before with genealogies. When they're named, it's like naming the tribes and people groups. If you remember, we had that chart we looked at in Genesis 10, that table of nations that has all of them. They're all color-coded and everything. That's what you get with a genealogy like this. It's naming the tribes around you, kind of naming how they got there. We're also going to meet this character called Keturah. I want to silence my watch because it keeps buzzing. Keturah is this other wife of Abraham that he marries after Sarah dies. Way back when we were talking about Hagar, we talked about how Jewish commentaries are kind of split down the middle. Sometimes this is understood to be Hagar itself. In fact, when Keturah and Hagar are mentioned in other books of the Old Testament, there are sometimes they are written as two different people, and there's sometimes they're understood to be one person. And so I think it might be a fun idea to entertain that Abraham kind of loved Hagar, and then he came back and he married her later after Sarah dies. But you could read it both ways. She could have been a different person. If she is, it's going to name us all these different people. And here yet again, we're naming the different tribes. So some of them sound more familiar, like Midian. And if we have... Oh, I didn't bring that. I had another picture we're going to look at with the different tribes, but that's not that important. This is just naming the tribes around Israel and Jacob. It's explaining how they got there and where they came from. Abraham ends up buried back in that same place as Sarah. You can go visit their graves today if you really wanted to. That's really most of this genealogy part before we get to Jacob and Esau. It's kind of just an insert to finish the Abraham story and the others. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions on that part?
I like this one sentence.
Which
this is
one?
the length, this is 25:7. This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age. I'd say old is right.
Oh, I did want to make one little note. Because when I practiced this, I forgot to mention this part when it comes up later. With the naming of Abraham's age right here. Actually, I think it's the next slide. This next occurrence we're going to see with Jacob and Esau, it's Abraham's funeral that they're at. And so when they cook the red lentil soup, still today, that is, I thought this was cool. I was listening to a Jewish sermon I might send this out. It was kind of interesting. It was like a Messianic Jews synagogue that I was listening to. But it's still today. The morning food, you make red lentil soup for people when someone has died, and it's based on this story and kind of when someone dies, this is what you do, because that's what they did here. Thank you for mentioning that age part, because I was going to forget. So here we're going to see the birth of Jacob and Esau, and this is that continuation of chapter 25, and like seems to be kind of familiar. There is strife. Nothing can go easy. There's always strife between people. And these two sons are in conflict. So Jacob and Esau. And if you remember when they come out and like there's a foot that comes out first or a hand, so they tie a rope on it and they go back in. And then Esau is born first with Jacob riding on his heel as they come out. And you kind of get this idea that they've been fighting since the very beginning. And so you get two sons that are brothers. They're not twins, how you would think of twins. These guys are opposite. So Esau is red and he's hairy. He's described as a hunter and a man of the woods. So this part where he comes up asking for food. I'm laughing because it's funny. So it says, this is in verse 29. So Esau came in from the field and he was famished. And the word for famine, it's like ravenous. It's like a ravenous dog. There's some very primitive, kind of, not primitive, but animalistic Hebrew words that are used. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff." And it's kind of like, eat red stuff now. Like the Hebrew, it's very animalistic. And he's like, "For I'm famished." And it says, therefore he was called Edom, because Edom is red. Because they are in the desert where it's red. So Jacob said, and in Jacob's Hebrew is the most refined and legally structured. First, sell me your birthright. And the Hebrew, like the me part is at the end of the Hebrew, which is a strange, like their language is very different here. And then Esau says, "I die. Why birthright?" I mean, it's like just very, like he sounds like an ape or something. And so I just wanted to bring that part up. So Jacob gives Esau this lentil soup, this red lentil soup, and that's still what you do when people are mourning. But you get this idea here that this could have been Abraham's funeral. And so this was a special meal that would have been celebrated. One thing to note too, so Esau is this man of the field. He's a hunter. And some of the Jewish commentators will have Jacob, like they were so different than each other that Jacob is a vegetarian, which is why he's making lentil soup. Like they do everything to be different from each other. And Jacob is called a simple, is what some translations say. I put in parentheses perfect, because that I think is a better translation of the Hebrew. He's an ideal man. He lives in tents. When you hear living in tent, that sounds like a homeless person, someone's camping, but tent living is right in the high life back here. If they're nomadic, if you've seen like in movies, people have like elaborate houses in these tents. That's what Jacob does. He sits on the best cushions. He's in the shade. He eats fine red lentil soup any day of the week that he wants. They are very different people. Do you make lentil soup?
I do make lentil soup.
But it's green.
Is it red? No, it's not red.
You should
No
make
one's
us some.
dying.
You should make us some soup one time. That'd be fun.
You know, Susan, that's interesting. I always thought, like, you know, when Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, they were still young men, but evidently it's a long time has passed.
So once we get copies of things. So here we're hearing a version of the birthright. The actual part where he steals it happens later. And so this is the time where he is, what this is telling us about Esau is Esau doesn't really care about the legal transactions of how birthrights work. So so Esau is presented as wild and disrespectful. He doesn't care about what promises he makes because he's the firstborn. He can have whatever he wants. And so what? I'll give you a promise and I'll take your soup. It doesn't really matter because I'm the firstborn son. That's kind of how it presents. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, but why
Yeah,
does
okay.
he say he's about to die?
He's just being dramatic.
Oh.
No one dies because they hunted for a day. It's this outrageous. He's complaining and grumpy, and
He must not have been a good hunter because he's hungry.
well, you gotta prepare food when you hunt,
You have to-
and he's too lazy to cook for himself.
All right.
That's kind of how he's being presented. This is the idea here is not that Jacob is like being conniving and stuff, but the idea is Esau he doesn't really care. Like what's the birthright matter? I'm the son. I'm going to get everything. I'm the firstborn.
I think he cares later, and then
when he starts complaining later about it, it's like a whining child. Like, give me that toy. Like, well, that was what I was. Like, yeah. This isn't supposed to present Esau as that good of a guy. The other part that we're going to see is Esau is going to care more about the desires of the flesh versus like this blessing from God. So I think if we want to look at this and kind of walk away with the story, it's looking at our own selves and when do our kind of short-term desires maybe overtake what God is doing. And like Esau, what we're seeing is almost like a testing of faith between these two brothers. Who is the one that's... Because this isn't just about inheritance, it's about receiving the covenant and continuing this work of God. Esau doesn't care about it. He just sold his God-given right to continue the covenant for soup. Where Jacob is working after it. It's kind of how they're being presented. And I think we do that in our lives too, where there are hardships we'd rather not go through, like being hungry for a day, in our calling to what God has. I think that's a lesson we can take away from this. Don't be like Esau. Be like Jacob, even though he doesn't look that good right here. And we're as we look next week at the rest of Jacob, he's called the deceiver. But that is to say he's smart. He uses his smarts. I found this picture. I would have printed this out. I'm still waiting to get permission from the author. I found it online, and I haven't heard back from them. I hope I will by next week. But what is it? I think it's called Smart Art. I will send the link out to this. I really like this. So I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's words around it. It says like rivalry, blessing, prophecy, and there's instant gratification. It's got all these kind of moral lessons you learn from this. Here we go. Here's one that's a little bigger. So here's the two brothers where he's grabbing the heel. Here they are in the womb kind of fighting with each other. And as we're going to see when they're born, Rebecca favors Jacob. And here's this little red baby right here with curly hair. That's Esau. And Isaac favors Esau. Here they are. This is a scroll that says birthright. And this is the hairy Esau. He's giving it to Jacob. And there's some other parts that are going to happen here as we walk through it. I have found this. So whoever this person is, she is painting through the Torah with these little lessons. And so I'm asking her permission if we can use them in here. But I haven't heard back, so I didn't want to print it. But here he's walking. This is the footsteps of Isaac and Abraham. So Jacob walks in those same footsteps. And here he comes to Gerar, so we're about to get to that. And these are the 3 wells that they built. And then he makes this peace with Abimelech. I mean, this just like, I haven't actually looked at it in this much detail. It was small on my computer. This just kind of walks through what we're going to look at. And then you're going to see where he steals the blessing, and he's dressed up with the hairy stuff. I really like these pictures. And then he's going to flee because they tell him to go now. That's actually all that we're looking at today. I just found this yesterday. So I didn't even base my slides on this, but it's the same section. It's kind of cool. This is what's going to happen next week. And these are the different tribes. This thing is just really cool. The tribe has something that pictures all of them. So like Judah is a lion. Zebulun's a boat because they live by the ocean. Joseph is, remember they had good farmland. they kept that special area with good farmland. Yeah. That's Esau and Jacob. Let me come back to you. Any more kind of questions about this first interaction between them? Any comments like, I don't want to be like that guy, or I don't want to be like this other guy? Bless you.
I'm not sure I want to be like either one of them.
Yeah, no, you don't. When the brother Bible study came, we had a Jewish guy come and talk about this story. And I don't remember that guy's name, but he teaches at one of the local synagogues. And he was like, well, this is why us Jews love our scriptures, because, yeah, he's an asshole, and you know it. And so, like, but he's our father. He's ours, and that's who we follow. One part I did want to say is, so Esau's name is like red or hairy, something like that, and Edom is kind of named that. Jacob, it's a play on word for the Hebrew word for heel. But the original etymology is probably something about God's favor, and for some reason I just forgot it in my brain because I didn't put it in my PowerPoint. So, but here in the story, it has to do with, it's a play on word to heel. It kind of sounds the same if you said it in a funny accent. Okay. I hope I get permission. I'd love to get those printed out. That would be cool. Chapter 26, we're going to come to the sister fib part 3. If you remember last week, we looked at our chart and we looked at Gerar, which is way over in that, I guess for you, that's over here, the coastal region, over by the Philistines. We mentioned that Gerar is a Philistine town. That's anachronistic because the Philistines weren't there yet, and Gerar's the Philistine name for the town, and they didn't have kings yet. But just to make note of that, here they are over where the Philistines are going to be. And the Philistines were these sea people that came in and conquered the land. So they are foreigners as well in the land. And this sounds really familiar to the first 2 sister fib stories. That first one, Abraham is in Egypt, if you remember. And he says that Sarah is his sister, and which is technically kind of true. And the Pharaoh ends up taking Sarah into the concubine with all the rest, and then everyone gets cursed with boils. There's all these plagues that come, and then they leave with a lot more money than they had. It sounds very much like the Exodus. Again, these motifs are all repeated. Then it happens again, and he goes to the same guy, Abimelech, and he does the same exact thing. He says, "This is my sister." And the same thing happens where he goes to marry her, and the people someone has a dream this time, and he calls Abraham a prophet. And then they make this covenant of peace. Well, now his son comes in, and guess what? He comes back again, and he says, "This is my sister." And thankfully, Abimelech kind of learned his lesson last time, and he doesn't take Rebekah to be the wife. But Isaac and Rebekah you kind of get the idea they're making out in public. They love each other so much, they're very fond of each other. And they're doing it out in public, and someone sees them, and he's like, "I don't think that's his sister." And so cat's out of the bag, and then Abimelech is like, "Why would you do this to me? Like, get out of here, go away." So there's a few things I want to look at with this part. The foreigner learned the lesson before Abraham and Isaac did. So they caught on not to take another person's wife when they come in your land before they could learn to stop lying. And so here again we see this lesson. You don't have to be unfaithful. God will protect you. You don't have to lean into your own devices. Just trust God. Like if you're going to be used by God, God will keep you safe. The foreigner is going to learn it before you can. I mean, it's kind of like shaking your head. The other thing with commentators, we've talked about this before. A lot of commentators think that this story with Isaac comes first because it has the most detail. And then the other stories are kind of pointing towards this one, if that makes sense. So this is the more, yeah.
Why would they think that the males would not go after a sister as much as they would go after a wife?
It's because they don't kill you for your sister, they kill the husband, I guess. I don't know.
Women were chattel.
Yeah.
Yeah, but why is a sister more protected than a wife?
Well, because you
The
can't
opposite.
you can't marry someone who's married, so kill the husband.
Right, but.
You don't have to kill the brother. So it's Isaac, he's keeping himself safe.
But they can just take the sister.
Yeah, he doesn't care.
Yeah, so, but I don't
It's
get
it's
why-
about the like Abraham and Isaac here, they're selfish and keeping themselves safe instead of kind of being a man and keeping their wife safe. They're lying at her expense.
And so he would let them take the sister.
And they won't harm him.
But to take the wife, they would kill him.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right.
So not a good thing to do. And it's because they're so
Shows an
beautiful.
attitude too.
Yeah, like he loves her, but does he really?
Yeah.
And that comes back to, so with this public display of affection, the words here for Isaac, I found this to be a little interesting. They're animalistic in his passions. It's like he couldn't contain his passions or his lust, and which is why he's being so public with making out with Rebecca. And it's almost like you're seeing that animalistic side that Edom has, and that might be why Isaac favors Edom, is they're both men of passion. They're in tune with their emotions, where Jacob is more kind of feeble and conniving, like Rebecca is. But what ends up happening out of this is that Abimelech is like, well, we won't bother you. You just do your thing. And he ends up having lots of animals, but he doesn't take anything from them. The animals multiply. God continues to bless Jacob. And so we're seeing this blessing come from. The question I have with here is, I missed over this part. So it would have made sense to go to Egypt, not to this land of the Philistines. Because there's a famine in the land, and God comes to him and says, hey, there's a famine. Don't go to Egypt. Go to the other place. When there's a famine, you should go to Egypt. That has all the food. But he ends up going to the Philistines, and God blesses him for it. So he's blessing his faithfulness to follow what God says. Would you follow God when you felt like you were being called by God to do something less logical? So here there's a famine. You could become destitute. The only logical place is to go to Egypt, and he goes the other direction. It doesn't really make sense that you would do that in a famine. There's no reason you would go there, and yet God blesses it. And so that's the question to ponder about. We're seeing Jacob's faith here. Isaac's faith here. Okay. After this kind of occurrence, they end up digging 3 wells. The first one means contend. And they dig this well, and then the Philistines come out and they're like, no, that's our well. That's our land. And they say, okay, you can have this one. Can we dig over there? And they're like, yeah. So they go dig another well, and they find water. And so the men come back and they say, no, this is our land. And it means to accuse or to be hostile. And they're like, seriously? Okay, you take this well. Can we have that land? And they say, yeah, you go over there. And they go and they dig this other one. And it ends up that King Abimelech comes out to meet Isaac. And he's like, why is there such hostility between our men? Let's make an oath together. Because they keep kind of driving him out farther and farther into the desert where there's less and less water. It's kind of putting them in a dangerous situation. So they make peace. They have a meal together. They stay the night. And that next morning, they find water in this other well, which is where Beersheba is, where the name comes from. That's a very special place. We've been here before. They called it Oath. Now we're going to call it 7. I might have those backwards. Wait, let me look. Somebody fact check me on this. I might be. It has both names. One time it means 7, one time it means oath. I think this time it means oath. It's verse 33 and 26. And the other time it means 7 because there's 7 other cities or 7 hills that surround it. And so kind of what we see with this is Isaac, like Abraham, is learning to make peace with those in the land. And again, we're seeing God's blessing with this well. And this well becomes another sign of covenant. And they're given ownership rights of this well. It becomes their land. So again, if you're coming in to have a conquest of the land and you own part of it, it kind of makes sense if your ancestors own that land too. But what we're going to see at the end of this chapter is that Esau is going to marry 2 Hittites. And he really just does this out of spite for Jacob. So we're seeing them do anything in spite of each other. It's just to be contrarian. And just like how Sarah and Abraham have made this big deal that Isaac have a wife out of the same land, or as their ancestors from Mesopotamia, not from the Canaanites, the same idea is for Jacob. That and Esau, they're not supposed to marry the Canaanites, and Esau does. And so what we're seeing here is Jacob is the one who's actually living according to the covenant, not Esau. Like, if Esau is the one who's supposed to inherit the covenant, he can't keep breaking the covenant expectations, which is that you don't marry the Canaanites. And so what we're seeing in this story is that Esau's not he's not the good candidate to be the one who carries it. He does everything wrong. Yeah.
It says here, though, they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the Hebrew word there, it's the idea of being contrarian or provocative, is how some translations will say. They did it to provoke Isaac and Rebekah. So he's doing it to. It's like when your son goes out and gets the girl he's not supposed to date, and then he just goes off and marries her after you've already said you would be out of your mind to marry her, and he does. And it's not because he likes her; it's just because he doesn't like you. That's kind of what he's doing right here. And so it's to show us that he's not a good son. It made life bitter. And part of it too is what we're going to see in the next scene. Rebekah really doesn't like Hittites.
Yeah.
She really, really doesn't like them. And so he is not being nice to his mom. And he marries 2 to make it worse. Does that make sense, kind of how we are seeing in these stories that Esau, it's not just that he is not given the birthright, he doesn't deserve the birthright. He does everything wrong. And he does it on purpose. He's not just fumbling around making mistakes. He doesn't care enough. He trades it for food. He marries 2 of the wrong women. He's messing up everything. There's no way he could be the one to take the covenant. Any questions on this part? Okay. And so we're going to see that he's going to lose this covenant promise here in the next chapter. So we saw with the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, they travel all the way to this foreign land to find someone, because you don't want to marry someone from the land. Abe dies. We saw the genealogy. You can look at that on the chart. One of the girls Esau marries is Ishmael's granddaughter, I guess, or daughter. And then we see this sister fib, part 3. But now we're going to come to when Isaac is nice and old. I wanted to find this picture, and I couldn't find it online, so I bought this icon for $25. And so since I bought it, I printed it out because I want to get my money's worth. So here we go. This is from a private collection in Russia at some church. And for some reason, you're not allowed to just look at a picture of it. You have to buy it. And so it is the only icon that I could find with Isaac and Jacob, where he's dressed up. You can't really see it, but he's in the camel's hair and he's wearing these clothes. And the coolest part is the clothes that he's wearing. It's the clothes the colors Jesus wears. And so it's like he's standing in place of Jesus here before Isaac. And Isaac here looks a lot like Abraham would look. The other pictures of this all looked really cheesy, and I just did not like them. So I wanted to print this out, and that was probably a waste of money. But I have it now. I'm going to put it on my wall. This story, Isaac is an old man now, and he's very, very frail. He is so frail that he can't even get out of bed very well. And he can't even see very well. And that's really embarrassing for who Isaac is, that he can't see anymore. if you remember Ishmael, it's God who sees. And they were in that place like God sees when he's named. It means God hears. He can't see or hear anymore. I mean, it's kind of like there's this play on words. It's embarrassing. He's at his lowest point. And the way Jacob steals this, it's not seen favorably. It's like rubbing salt in the wound with how weak and frail Isaac is. Even though Isaac is an old man, he's not dumb. And so he's like, I'm getting ready to die, and I love Esau, so I want Esau to take my promises, my blessings. But Rebekah is eavesdropping on this interaction. So he tells Esau, go out and make my favorite soup. By the way, when I mentioned about Jacob being a vegetarian, you get this idea, even though Jacob is always the one who cooks, he doesn't know how to cook meat. And Rebekah has to cook the meat for him. So that kind of reinforces that idea. But Rebekah comes up with this plan. So she goes to Jacob and she says, go kill a goat, even though it's not a deer, which is what Isaac wants. And I'm going to make this favorite soup because I know how to make it because I'm his wife and I can cook because women work in the kitchen. And so Jacob goes and kills the goat. And then she says, put goat skin on your arms and on your neck, because Esau was that hairy. So he's ape-like. He talks like an ape. He's as hairy as an ape, and he's red like an ape, I guess. And so he does this, and Rebekah's smart, and she's like, that might not be enough. So she's like, go put on Esau's clothes too. And I don't know if that means Esau smelt bad. I'm not quite sure what it has to do, but Esau has a certain scent, and I don't know what that means. I'm imagining it means he maybe smells like an animal or something. I don't know. A little gamey. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I mean,
So,
animal mothers could tell their children by scent. So
I guess so.
Maybe,
Well,
maybe back then people could too.
or it's like Jacob was well perfumed and didn't smell like sweat. I'm not really sure what it's trying to imply, but he has a smell about him. And that's about the only thing Isaac has going for him. He can still smell. And so just to cover all their bases. I don't want to go too much through kind of the interactions, but he brings the soup and twice he lies. Isaac asks him directly, who are you? I am your... He doesn't say... he says firstborn, which is a title. He doesn't say I am your first son. Like firstborn is a title. It doesn't just mean who was born first in the order of birth. Am I saying that correctly? Am I making sense? Okay, all right, thank you. But he lies. He says, I am Esau, your firstborn, using that title, firstborn. And then, yet again, he says, are you Esau? Yes, I am Esau. This isn't good. You don't lie to your dad, and you don't lie to an old crippled person who can't see or hear anymore. I mean, he does everything wrong. Isaac gets suspicious because he uses the personal name of God, Yahweh. And he talks a lot more than Esau does in his interaction. When Esau comes in, he's like, here's your food, give me my blessing. Jacob is he's talking too much. And so they end up, though, he feels the skin and he smells them and he goes, well, you must really be Esau, you smell like him. And so here he gives him the blessing. Do I have it? I don't think I have the blessing. So that's in verse 27. I want to read these two parts. So, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers. By the way, there's brothers. I found that interesting. So maybe he did have other kids. And may your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be whoever blesses you. In a lot of ways, this sounds like two other promises. Is there any other kind of blessings like this sounds like to you?
Like Abraham.
So the end of it sounds like Abraham. Cursed be those who curse you, blessed be those who bless you. What about this other part with brothers bowing down and things like that?
Joseph?
Sounds like Joseph. He's kind of like this bridge between Abraham and Joseph. The end of it, it's the same blessing Abraham is given. That middle part about other like brothers bowing down to you and about grain and harvest, it's the same, the dream from Joseph where his brothers bow down to him and stuff. I think that's on purpose. I don't think that was a mistake. He's like a bridge between it. So here, Jacob stills the blessing. And this means two things. First, he takes the whole inheritance. So I just find this interesting. There was nothing left out for the other brother. One brother was to inherit it all. The other was just going to have to make it kind of on his own. And so everything now is given to Jacob. And I guess it's like they signed a document. It's his now. Once it's said, it is done. The other thing is that there's this prophetic blessing. And that's the part that we read about here. I have two things to say about that. One thing. It is understood when someone is blessed by God and they give some kind of blessing like this, God honors that blessing. And so when Isaac is speaking here, it's not just like he is wishing it's happening. It's almost like he's prayerfully commanding God that this is what will happen, if that makes sense. And this isn't just something that happens in the Bible. It's done in other places too. But he's almost like he is persuading the future for this to happen to the son. The other thing to know about this is this was written way, way, way later. And so you're also describing what already happened. So if you're uncomfortable with the idea of people kind of telling God what to do and who to bless, remember this is written later and describing what has already happened. So I wanted to say those two things, but what's happening in the story is this is a prophetic blessing that he's giving to Jacob. He is saying, remember, before God has made the promises, like you will be a great nation, others will serve you, you'll be a blessing. Right here, Isaac is doing the blessing to Jacob. And so we're almost seeing like as this covenant people is being made, the people are able to almost speak on behalf of God for what God will do. And I don't think we should take that part lightly in the story, especially as us as inheritors of the covenant. It's almost like be careful with your words because God listens to you. Be careful with your prayers. Esau also gets blessed, and his blessing isn't that special. He says, this is verse 39, "See, away from the fatness of the earth shall your home be, and away from the dew of heaven on high." It's the opposite. "By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. When you break your loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck." Does that sound familiar? That part about living by the sword? That's the same blessing that Ishmael got, that he would have to live by a sword. So the promise that Esau gets is you're going to have to work hard in life. You'll have to live by your sword because no one's going to give it to you easy. And this is almost like a fulfillment of Esau's life trajectory. His whole life he has gone the easy route and expected everything would just be given to him because he was the firstborn. And now he's saying nothing easy will come to you again, and you'll have to make your own way out of it. So you'll have to break your own yoke to be set free. What we see here is that Jacob is going to become the heir and the son. He does it because he deserved it. That's what we've seen in the stories. Esau is selfish. He doesn't care about what you're supposed to do. He sold his birthright because he doesn't care about this covenant with God for the soup. He comes in and demands to be blessed by his father, and then he whines like a baby when he doesn't get it. So he's really not presented in a favorable light. And Jacob here, I like this icon because he's kind of presented as a precursor to Jesus in a lot of ways. We're going to see that more and more as he comes on. He's not perfect. None of us are perfect, but he's who God is going to continue to work through. And in a lot of ways, it's because Jacob deserved it more than Esau. What happens after this is that Jacob is scared of Esau, and his mom says, "Flee," and so he does. And so he runs out. And that is our story of Jacob so far.
Alexander, could you go back to the picture? That looks like it's a picture that's painted on a wall.
Yeah, this is a church in Russia.
We went to, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And it was interesting because you'll see, it was Christian at one time, and you'll see Christian pictures there, and then all of a sudden, right next to it will be Islamic things that take over. And it was fascinating seeing that back and forth, the same structure. That picture reminds me of what I saw in that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, this was painted in the 1638 or something like that. And I really could not find another thing like this that I liked. But church art is fun. I wish we had more. If you've ever been to an Orthodox church, they'll paint they have this sphere and they'll paint the stories out. Or if you've been across the street at Sacred Heart, they have a lot of those. I love those things. We can tell our stories. That's Jacob so far. He is not perfect, but what we continue to see when God is making this covenant people, no one is perfect. They have a chance to be faithful. That doesn't mean they won't fail sometimes. But faithfulness doesn't mean you won't mess up. And the idea is we, as us in this room, as the covenant people of God, we don't have to be perfect to be faithful, but we are called to remain in our faithfulness. And God works through you and blesses you. So I hope we're like Jacob. Even Rebecca, who starts off as such like a beautifully good character, she's seen as so conniving and everything. So sneaky, yeah. So I don't know. Any parts that stood out for you? We're done with the presentation part. I'm just curious of what was your favorite parts for this story?